Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at Gonzaga University in the Hemmingson Center or online. My name is Dr. Brian Henning, and I have the honor of being the director of the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. I'm a professor of philosophy and environmental studies here at Gonzaga, and it's great to be able to kick off this semester's part of our lecture series with our first talk. And I'll be introducing our first speaker of the series just shortly, but to look forward a little bit, we have several more events. As you can see, this is the first of a series, which has characteristic breadth and depth. On the 5th, we'll be hearing from Juliet Sinistero from the University District about generous urban design, which should be fascinating. Then our colleague, Dr. Bi Zhao from Gonzaga's Political Science Department, will be talking about her visit to Azerbaijan for the last COP meeting. Gonzaga has applied to receive observer status, and if we're successful, eventually we'll be able to send groups of students with Dr. Zhao to be able to participate in those international deliberations. And so we hope to have this a recurring feature every spring, that she would come back and share what she and the students learned at the international negotiations. February 24th, I'm really excited that we'll be hosting a wonderful talk with an activist and professor from San Francisco State, Gopal Dayani, who will be talking about the fact that we are eager to transition to a future which is less destructive, but it's not guaranteed that that transition will be one that is just. And so as a Jesuit Catholic humanist institution, we're really interested in featuring conversations about ethics and justice as well. Then in March, we're going to host a scientist from the Union of Concerned Scientists about small modular nuclear reactors. Because of the rapidly increasing need for energy for things like Bitcoin mining and AI, we need to be able to figure out how we meet those energy demands. And some people think that the way to do that is through nuclear energy, specifically new small modular reactors. And so we'll learn whether that's a good idea or not, at least from one perspective. And then in April, we have 2 more talks. Gonzaga has had an active student effort to try and persuade our Board of Trustees to divest from fossil fuels for many years now. And we'll be hosting a speaker, Anna Johnson, who will be talking about the connection between fossil fuel divestment and our Catholic mission as an institution. And then I'll be rounding out the semester on the 4th anniversary of the Institute. We turned 4 on Earth Day in April, and I'll be talking about what it is to be a young person graduating in this time in the context of a changing climate. So I hope that you'll go to gonzaga.edu/climate events and register for these, whether here in person or online. I'm happy to say that all of these are going to be in person with the exception of March 26th, and that will be online only. So make sure if you're used to coming here, don't come here in this physical space on March 26th, because we'll all be on Zoom, and so you should be too. As you might imagine, hosting these events is expensive and complicated, and this isn't the only thing we do. We also have a lot of active projects helping young people learn about climate change through the Climate Literacy Project, or helping our community respond to the changes in our environment in ways that feature those who are most vulnerable through our Climate Resilience Project. And those take tremendous resources. And if you have not been hiding under a rock for the last 10 days, you know that the sources of support that we would normally have from the federal government are under threat. And so if you have the means to support us, this would be a really good time to do that because although we have lots of good federal support, it's not clear whether we'll be able to use it like many other projects around the country. And so it would be really, really useful to us to have your support if you find yourself in a position to be able to do that. Before introducing Dr. Spearman, I just wanted to then maybe reflect just briefly on the position we find ourselves in at this moment, and just to say before we learn about a really interesting and important figure in the history of American thought, that we exist as an academic project to figure out ways that Gonzaga as an institution can do more to serve the inland Northwest, to help us to respond and understand the climate crisis. And Some would say that that is a mistake. Some would say that environmental justice is something to, is a political issue that one side thinks is real and the other side doesn't care about. But I think that everybody cares about fairness. That everybody cares about the fact that whether you have a lot of money in your pocket shouldn't be an indication of whether or not you're more likely to experience extreme heat or suffer from wildfire smoke or have incinerators located in your community. So everyone should have meaningful access to power. So the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens and the meaningful access to power is all we mean by environmental justice. And so anybody who is against that is against fairness. And that's confusing. So as we read the news, it's easy to get discouraged. But I would say that one of the things that I would find really meaningful right now is looking for opportunities for agency. For me, the best antidote to despair is agency and action, and looking for ways, then small or big, to make a difference is better than all the therapy you could afford at this moment, at least for me. So just let's all remember that the future is still contested. What we do matters. Each 1/10 of a degree warming has dramatic impacts on the species and places and people that we care about. It's not all or nothing. Each small achievement makes a difference. And so please let's not forget that tonight. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you one of my colleagues in the philosophy department. Dr. Darian Spearman is an assistant professor of philosophy here at Gonzaga. We're so thankful that he joined us here. His research interests and scholarship and teaching focus on Africana philosophy, eco-philosophy, philosophy of myth, and the philosophy of religion. What a really fascinating intersection, right? Aren't we lucky to have him here? So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Spearman?
Thank you, Brian. Hey, it's great to see everybody. Lots of people I know from lots of different places. Hey, great. Okay. So as you know, my name is Dr. Spearman, and I'm here to share with you all a bit about Howard Thurman, who I find his thoughts and insights to be very important to our contemporary moment and where we're going in the future, right? And so that's why this is called Lessons from Howard Thurman's Philosophy of Life, because he has a very particular view of what life is, how life is actualized, and how everything fits together that we're going through. So to begin, who is he? So this quote is probably the most famous quote from him that you might have seen online, right? It says, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." And as you'll see from what we talk about throughout the rest of this talk, he has a very particular understanding of what life is and what it means to come alive. And as you'll see, what he's asking is for people to come from the actual vital spark of life within themselves, to trust in that. And that part of our job as a society is to create a context for as many people to live from that place as possible. Because that part of us, as you'll see, can do things that we can't necessarily imagine, right? As in leading to all of this that we are in right now. So he was a spiritual leader, particularly for the civil rights activist. And he understood his role as that of being a spiritual leader. He often would bring the people together and ask them questions and say, hey, if this is what you want, are you doing something that's actually leading to that, right? As a spiritual leader, he was also one of the people who went on a delegation to India to meet on the level of spiritual activism. right? He talks about a profound mystical experience with another Indian man, as well as seeing the Himalayas. But they were kind of comparing notes, right? In Indian philosophy, ahimsa is a very important principle, non-violence, non-harm. And the idea is that it generates a spiritual force that can cause change. And that there's real value in trying to maintain your spiritual integrity when trying to cause change in others. He was also a mystic. He was someone who felt the presence of God pervading through all things and sought to be as close and unified with that presence as possible, though maintaining his own distinctness. And particularly, he found that his closest connection with the interconnectedness of all things was in nature, as we'll talk about. And he was also a philosopher, that he really was trying to advance concepts. So the book that we're going to focus on is a very particular book called The Search for Common Ground, which he copyrighted in 1971, but was published in 1973. And as you see, it's near the end of his life, right? He dies in 1981. And so he writes this book because there's a crisis going on, a very serious crisis. The civil rights movement, this kind of spiritual movement, this kind of genuine awakening that's sparking so many other movements around the world and around the country, is starting to implode in various ways. Why? Because a lot of younger black people don't necessarily believe in the tenets of that perspective anymore, right? Martin Luther King, who Thurman was a mentor for, by the time Martin Luther King is about to die in 1968, he's starting to get booed when he's going to northern cities like Chicago and places like that, right? Because in a lot of cities, people are feeling that the change isn't coming fast enough. And a new slogan, a new idea is starting to emerge that he talks about in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here?, which everyone should read, because he talks about where the civil rights movement is supposed to be going, and it's not quite where it ends up going. But it's black power, right? People are starting to say, young people are starting to say, I don't want to march with white people. What do I look like getting beat up to convince somebody else that I'm a human being? Why do I need to change someone else's soul, change someone else's consciousness, right? If you can't see that I'm a human being, then maybe the problem is you, right? If you can't understand by now that, James Baldwin said this, that you wouldn't want done to you what you've done to me. If you can't understand that, then maybe there's an impasse. Maybe nonviolence isn't what we're supposed to be doing, right? The Black Panthers and other groups like that begin to say that self-defense, self-assertion is the only thing that people really respect. It's the only thing that's really brought genuine change. The United States itself only exists because of a violent revolution, right? The founding fathers and all the people didn't say, let's appeal to King George and convince him that we shouldn't be taxed anymore and that he should give up all the land that his royal charter secured with soldiers and wealth. He should just give that to us because we deserve it, because it's unfair that he's violating our rights. That didn't work. We had to fight, right? And the Panthers, on their first newspaper, they put the Bill of Rights, right? The idea that you have a right to have weapons against the government. And who is the dominant force that the Panthers black people are being attacked by, especially in the 60s and things like that? The police, who are literally government representatives. So what better, literally constitutionally sanctioned violence than using guns against the police if they're violating what they're doing against you, right? And Black Power was also a very strong slogan. Now words like the word black is very, it's accepted. It's what a lot of people of African descent call themselves in this country. But back then, like my grandmother, for instance, she was born in the 40s in the South Missouri, she said when she was a kid, calling someone black was fighting words, right? It's like calling someone like the color asphalt or something like that, right? So they were very intentional of choosing something that would be in your face, that would be very strongly assertive, right? And that's the idea, that's what we need to do. We need to protect ourselves. Integration is not going to work. Coming together, unifying, that's a fake dream. It's never going to happen. What we can do is assert ourselves. And so at this moment, Thurman is wondering, But before we get there, we also see other movements. The feminist movement also has a separatist movement that's happening this time, right? That women, same thing. How long do we have to convince you to stop doing these things to us, right? It shouldn't take a whole movement to convince you not to do things that are very disgusting towards women, right? So the idea is that maybe men are the problem. We need separation. We need our own spaces, our own places, maybe even our own city, right? Where we can live together and find something new away from these people, right? So Thurman is wondering, well, then what is the real foundation? What is the reason that people should still try to strive for a common community? What's the reason that we should come together? What's the reason for unification, for believing in community? In other words, what's the reason for integration? If integration is going to be more than just bodies in a room, if integration is going to be all of us coming together and seeing ourselves as the same fabric of life, then it's going to require some kind of sacrifices. And black people were making those sacrifices. Women were making those sacrifices. All kinds of people, white people were making those sacrifices for that. But by the time you get to this point, no one wants to do that anymore. And even now, right, as our country is very divided in various ways, no one wants to be the one to say, hey, I'm gonna throw in the towel for unity, right? And there's good reason for that, right? So Thurman wants to give a reason for why unity, why integration, why a higher level of community is what we should be doing. And he finds it in the nature of life itself, right? So this is a quote from him that I'm going to read out. This is kind of how he introduces the search for common ground. For the religious man, there arrives always on the horizon a timeless, transcendent monitor by which not only is the direction of his life somehow guided, but also by which he is stabilized in the midst of the contradictions of his experience. But this does not release him from the necessity of seeking always to locate his profoundest religious insights in the very structure of his life as a living human being, spawned from the womb of the earth, and as a participant in all which sustains and supports life on the planet, right? And finally, he says, ultimately, all the dualisms of his experience as a creature must exhaust themselves in a corroborating unity fundamental to life, and not merely dependent upon that which transcends life by whatever name he seeks to patronize it. What does he mean by that? He says that even though for the religious person there is a transcendent God, there is a necessity to articulate the unity of experience in the language and ground of life itself. And there's reasons for that. One, that's how you're going to perhaps convince people, right? The Black Panthers, other people, many of these people, they are atheists, at least philosophically, right? Telling someone that Jesus or Muhammad or somebody wants you to do this, it's not going to convince a lot of people, right? This is one of the classic problems even in the slavery days, right? Where people were saying, don't you believe in God? How can you enslave us, right? And treat us this way and call yourself a Christian, right? So the idea is that it's not enough to just say, well, God wants us to do this. It has to be something that is tethered to life and that supports life, right? This is what he's talking about. This is where he sees the civil rights movement, the other movements moving towards, as something that's trying to actualize all life on the planet. Life is unfinished. We have a particular role to play in actualizing what life can be, right? So for Thurman, community is he's going to argue, is the ultimate realization of life's potential. This is why he's going to say the reason why we have to form community, the reason we should sacrifice for community, the reason why we should move towards integration and form new forms of community is that is what life is really about. That's the ultimate realization of life. So he quotes, he says, it's not an overstatement that the purpose of all arrangements and conventions that make up the formal and informal agreements under which men live in society is to nourish one another with one another. He says humans, we literally feed off each other, and not in a bad way. But that there's the energy, the presence, the life, the action within us feeds and sustains each other. And that's what life does, right? Life is constantly feeding off itself. And as it does this, it unlocks new possibilities for itself. This is the ecosystem, right? So society is an expression of fundamental truth. Life feeds on life. Life needs life. We come together in all these formations with all these rules and things like that is because we have to guarantee that the life within us can be adequately shared with the life in all around us. So the whole reason we live in society, community of sorts, tells us a truth about life. And he says the very basis of the idea that life is eternal emerges from life's unending realization of itself with itself. What do I mean by that? You take the first life, microbe, it splits, and so forth and so on, starts to consume itself, it starts to evolve and take new forms with that energy, and keeps going and going, right? You all are eating plants and animals. You're also relating to animals and plants. Their medicines are from plants and animals. All the things that we are constantly realized by life itself, right? Everything we are, life has somehow realized it with itself. It takes in other non-organic things into itself, but it's an ongoing process that, as far as it knows, has never ended. As I'll talk about later, much later, life has never been defeated. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist. And he argues that the degree to which the potential of any mode of life is actualized is the degree to which that expression of life experiences wholeness, integration, and community. Those three things. So, for example, we'll talk about it later, but when you're healthy, you're whole, right? Health, wellness, wholeness, those have relations to each other etymologically, right? Holiness is related to being whole, right? What makes something holy? It's complete. Integration, all the things are working together. And imagine and think about an ecosystem, as we'll talk about. Everything is related to each other. It's integrated. And community, right? Being able to live and have your inner life intertwined with other things. So the first thing he points to, there's other things he points to, but there's two things I'm going to talk about. One is the structure of living systems, and the other is what he calls common consciousness, right? So the first is ecosystems. He says they demonstrate the very genius of the concept of community. What he sees is when we form community with each other is just what the ecosystem is already doing. The difference is that we can be more intentional about it. And we can realize certain potentials in life by coming together. And community for him should include all living things to the extent that we can do so. So he says that, you know, when you look at an organism ecologically, you can't really draw the line between its inside and its outside. Where the ecosystem begins and it's well-functioning, the internal organism ends. And then the inside the organism begins, right? That they're so interwoven. This is why I like this abstract painting, because there's all these forms and they're all interwoven together. And if you look, you can kind of see certain things, but really, you can't, if you pull an organism out of an ecosystem, it's going to die very fast. And such that its inside is literally a reflection of the outside. And that, for Thurman, is the ultimate value of community. He would call that a form of community in nature. But not necessarily intentional, right? But the idea that everything is interwoven and kind of, for him, there's a certain type of balance or harmony that's established, right? And so he talks about herbivores and predators and, you know, plants grow, they get eaten, and then the other things it takes into itself, but it's all a reflection of all these different patterns. The second thing he talks about is the inner workings of the human body. He says that you are a community, as you are an ecosystem, at least to the bacteria inside of you and the cells. You are an environment, right? And so you can see for him this continual pattern of environments upon environments upon environments upon environments, right? That's what life is. There's all this communication happening within you right now to make me speak in a unified way. You're only seeing me as a unified person give a voice and talk and an idea, but there's all this coordination between all these different organisms inside of me to make that happen. What seems seamless and smooth, I made up a word, is actually a bunch of organisms working together. And that's a beautiful thing. And as you can see, part of what he wants us to do is to trust that in ourselves and believe in that. But as he says, when everything's working well, you don't even notice. You don't notice how many different organs and creatures and beings are all collaborating within you to make you exist, right? To have you be able to think about things that they're not even aware you're thinking about, right? It's only when you're sick, it's only when there's a problem, a rupture in that connection, that harmony, that then you realize, oh, wow, my stomach hurts, right? That this thing is separate from all the other things going on, and now I need to like deal with it, right? So for Thurman, this is part of the evidence that life realizes itself in community, right? To get to what we are, lots of other organisms had to come together and permanently relate to each other, right? I mean, my skin cells, you know, they die, but they're not going anywhere, right, until they die, right? They're not gonna just, my skin's not something that's like, I'm done. This guy, he's always eating too much McDonald's, like, I'm heading out, right? That's not what's gonna happen. They are permanently integrated into what I am. And it's happened millions and millions and millions and millions of years ago, right? So he says, it is not unreasonable then to assume that as he seeks community within himself, with his fellows, and with his world, he may find that what he's seeking to do deliberately is but the logic of the meaning of all that has gone into his own creation. And he means that broadly, right? But basically, our job, our task, and there are lots of different cultures that would agree with this, is to do with intention to realize life more and more and more in ways that it was doing by trial and error for billions of years through evolutionary process, right? We can now do that intentionally, right? The thing that led to us, the thing that led to trees, the thing that led to all these wonderful, miraculous beings and possibilities, right? That is in us. And we can actualize that intentionally, right? And so we have to seek community with each other. We also have to seek community within ourselves, right? That means having a unity, an integrity, a way of feeling connected within yourself. Many people feel disconnected from themselves. Trauma is a big part of that. One of the big things trauma does is disconnect you from yourself and from the world, but those things are linked, right? So you can start to see what he's arguing, right? That the reason why we should be striving for a new community, the reason why we should be coming together, the reason why we should be trying to establish a new possibility for life through our struggles is because that is what life does. To break away from that is to end what life is about. And so the next thing that he talks about is what he calls common consciousness, right? So he talks about, he gives examples of communication or play or connectivity between animals and humans as evidence that there's a common experience of life that we can share. There's a shared form of awareness between animals. He also includes plants as well, but he's like, that might seem crazy to people, but I think, you know, when I talk to my rose bushes, they kind of understand what I'm talking about. Maybe not completely, but they're growing because they feel something from me. And now with new books that talk about plant sentience, we're learning that plants are way more intelligent than we thought they were, and perhaps hear and remember. Not all plants, right? Plants are a very broad spectrum. It's like saying mammals, like saying all mammals, you know, speak English. No, they don't, right? Not even all humans do, right? But plants show a wide variety of behaviors that we didn't think they do. Scientifically, scientists didn't think they did. So he tells a story of when he was a boy. He grew up in Florida, and he went to go to his friend's house. His friend lives in a cabin, and he runs over there to, you know, play. He's probably about 9 or 10, and when he walks around the back, the father of his friend immediately shushes him, and he points to the back of the yard. And Thurman looks, and the baby, like a 1-year-old, 2-year-old baby, is playing with a rattlesnake. Just playing, right? And they're just playing, and it's just playing. And in that moment, Thurman uses as an example to show how in that openness of the child and the snake, they can have this experience together that will be hard for us to have now, right? And the baby, and they knew the reason why the father was quiet was because they knew that if they disturbed this too much, the snake would attack. And then he says there will be violence on earth, right? Referencing the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of sorts, right? For Thurman, this moment of the child playing with the snake is a kind of pointing to the original Garden of Eden, the original moment of what life was supposed to be like on the planet, of the possibility of our true potential. And so how the story ends is the baby plays with the snake, and eventually the baby's done. The baby turns away, and the snake goes off, and then at that moment, the father kills the snake, right? Why does he kill the snake? Well, because it's not something that you can, that kind of connection is not something you can control, right? This is the issue, right? This is the issue of what life is about, right? That you don't know if that snake could return and kill that baby. Or perhaps maybe when the child's 3 or 4, they're different. The snake comes around, the baby gets bit. Or the snake's around, it attacks somebody else, like a dog or something like that, right? So they couldn't figure out how to resolve that wonderful moment in a way that could be peaceful or joyous or deep in a kind of way. Instead, the snake gets killed, right? So he tells many stories, some of which I'll relate and some I won't. But he says that the sense of separateness between species is real, but it's not absolute. It's possible for an individual to get outside of its own context and get into the context of another species, right? That there's a shared level of awareness that all life forms, but he's going to focus on animals, can share. And many different cultures have relied upon that and utilized that to do all kinds of things. Right? Our culture doesn't do it as much anymore, right? But he gives a couple different stories. Like, for instance, he tells, there's a story, these are stories that he's recounting from things he's read or heard, but there's a circus in town, and a man named Mr. Hemingway, he comes down, and he starts talking to the animals. Now, obviously, they're not necessarily literally understanding, but for example, there's a polar bear, and Mr. Hemingway wants to go talk to the polar bear, and they're like, don't go talk to the polar bear. Like, he's really aggressive. He's kind of mean. Like, you don't want to deal with him, right? And Hemingway's like, no, it's cool. I'll do it. And they say that he starts talking in a way that's very musical in a certain kind of way. That is not like the sounds he's making and the way he's doing is not like how people normally talk. And he says that the bear then sits up and starts making some noises from his nostrils, and is totally like attentive to what the guy's saying. They're like, what are you doing? Like, what is that? He said, he's like, he said Indian, because at the time, he's like, I'm part Indian, it's just bear talk. Bears like me. That's what he says, right? But that's part of what's going on, is that there's a certain type, there are more stories that he gives, but these for him are evidence that there's a possibility that my inside, to some extent, can reach you. Now, he's not talking about like a full comprehension that I could do this, and like a dog would be like, yeah, man, Howard Thurman, right, great. But that there's a way for us to exchange and connect in ways that are way deeper than us, that point to the fact that the unity of life, the same structure within us, is universal throughout life, and thus we can connect through it with other life forms. So he calls it a boundless realm of life that all life forms are a manifestation of. When we can center ourselves within the center of life, the boundaries that define a particular life form can be transcended. This is for him a way to transcend the limitations. And he says it expands the possibilities for all life forms involved, right? That these indigenous people in this story, for instance, cultivated over time a certain type of communication with bears, right? It's something they realized. And it changed how the bears relate to life and humans, and it changed the possibility for humans. So part of our goal, part of what we're supposed to do, is to understand that life is one of the best things we can trust and rely upon if we need to transcend ourselves, if we need to transcend our limitations. What better thing to do than the thing that constantly transcends itself, right? To get to what we are, right? So, and this is what he says after the end, because people might say, like, dude, you're crazy. Like, you're talking about people talking with animals and dogs. He gives another story of a priest talking to a warthog in Africa, right? And I'll tell a story where basically these warthogs were destroying people's crops. This is a missionary account, but the guy was already a Catholic priest, the prior, and but the guy's town, they didn't attack the farm. The warthogs didn't attack it. So they're like, they come in like, how come they don't attack yours? And he says, I talked to them. And they're like, what? He says, I'm supposed to talk to them tonight, so if you want to come, you can come, right? So he shows up at like around the height of the full moon, he walks. This is not Thurman. This is a recount he's hearing from someone else. The guy, the explorer in Africa. The guy walks up to a clearing, and at night, this old blind warthog comes out with two younger warthogs flanking him, and the prior says some things to the warthog in his native African language, and then there's silence, and then the warthogs leave. And the guy who's with him is like, what just happened? Like, why did they come at this time? How did they know to appear? How did they understand what he was saying, right? So these things for Thurman are all evidence of this capacity to connect on a deeper level between life forms than we usually do. And so he says, my interpretation may be erroneous, being like what the extent of what's being said or understood, but the sense of being in touch across the barriers that divide is an important part of the reality of the experience. Even if there's not genuine, in-depth communication occurring, there clearly is some type of bridging of the barriers between different species occurring, right? He says, if the mind in man has an affinity with the world external to him, and if in his origin and continuity he's a child of nature, then the experience of being consciously in touch with other forms of conscious life around him is a vital part of all life that seeks to ever realize itself in many forms. Right? When men ignore this, their behavior very easily becomes wantonly destructive, and in their blindness, ignorance, or arrogance, they force expressions of life around them to fall short of actualizing their potential. In the extent to which this takes place, community itself is defeated in all life around us. If this is done, it may be that man himself is cut off from actualizing his potential and thus cannot know community in himself and the world of his fellows. So this is where the part of the reason why I brought his thought to you all is this kind of idea. That for him, an essential part of our thinking, of our growth and our development, is being able to deeply connect with the nature around us. And when we cannot do this, when we have that disconnect, we begin to become destructive, we begin to become controlling, and we begin to limit the possibility of potential for everything around us. That is essentially what's happening now with the crisis we face, that we are twisting and contorting the potential of life to do exactly what we want it to do, and we're no longer connecting with it. We've gained control of it to a certain extent that we don't have to connect into it very deeply. And so many of us are facing a disconnect from life, from the original creation, the original energy of creation, right? Thurman is a Christian mystic, so he understands it as an extension of whatever God is. But even if without that, there's a creative force that we emerge from that we have to be in contact with. And so some of the very difficulties we're facing, what are we supposed to do? What do we do next? How do we resolve all these problems? Part of the issue is that we've decided to take on this whole task alone, species-wise, civilizationally-wise, as in certain people aren't even allowed to genuinely participate. So coming together, connecting with each other deeply, connecting with the land, connecting with animals and plants, spending time with them, allowing them into ourselves, transforming them and transforming ourselves is an essential part of how we're going to do all this and part of the outcome of where he's wanting the civil rights movement and these things to go, right? To a broader movement for life, right? So I'm going to close. There's one more slide, but I'm excited to talk with you all more because that's what I really enjoy doing, right? But part of what we can understand is that the ecological movement or the crisis is a crisis of life. What life is supposed to be, where life is going, and life is taking many forms, and life is being repressed in many ways, right? Not just in terms of the environment being destroyed, but also homelessness, also the migration crisis, and all these things. These are all problems for life, right? These are problems for our home, as the title is called. So this image that I want to share is from the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was one of the reimaginings of what it meant to be black in America. And in this picture, you see slaves in Africa, the ships coming, but the black man is looking and seeing the North Star, right? The North Star comes to symbolize freedom, right? And I chose it because what a powerful, natural symbol for unlocking our potential. The idea that when the slave ancestors looked up and saw the North Star, they knew they couldn't be bound forever. And in that, they could endure and work for centuries to create the very reality that we're living in right now, where I'm talking to you about it, right? And so I've shared this because that there's a need for a surge of vitality in all kinds of movements, new images, new possibilities, new animals, new connections. Who knows? Maybe the North Star could be an image that we choose to represent where we're going and what we're about. Just as we've chosen the globe, maybe the North Star could be another one that integrates these various movements. So here are some things that we can get from Thurman's perspective. One, a vision of faith grounded in the process of life. Faith is one of the most important things to have faith in is faith in life. And that a lot of the anxiety and despair that people are facing is because they're actually disconnected from life. That the society has disconnected from us, and in that disconnect urges us to try to do something about it, but you're still disconnected, right? But when you can connect into life, you realize that it's a process that's been going on for billions of years, and it's never been defeated, right? Every wave of extinction, life has managed to overcome it. Is it the same as it was before? No. But if it was defeated, we wouldn't be here. And so we can trust that perspective. We can trust that we cannot lose if we're on the side of life. We can trust that. There's no better thing to trust than the thing that's continued and developed and grown to even be what we are, right? Second, a movement to actualize a new possibility of life on Earth. That's part of what we're doing right now. That's part of what we have to do, is to realize something that maybe hasn't been realized before. Or maybe realize in a different culture or a different context or a different species in a smaller scale, but we can realize it on a higher scale. And it might take some time to do that, but that's part of what our movement is about. It's not just about saving or protecting nature, but about actualizing a new possibility for life on Earth. And I'd also add beyond, because who knows where it's going, right? An expansion of the meaning of ecological justice. Eco, like in economics, has a root in the word home. And I take from the comedian, I think George Carlin, where he says, you know, we're not saving the planet. The planet's fine, right? I mean, in terms of the process. I mean, we can destroy the life. Life will come back, all that stuff, right? What we're saving is our home. We're saving the connections. We're saving the species. We're saving the meanings and things that we've interwoven with each other, right? That is what we're really saving. And that means that things like homelessness, things like the refugee crisis are also symptoms of the same cause, a crisis of home. We don't know how to be at home on this planet anymore, right? Every other species, other things, they figured out some type of equilibrium or problem to this problem, but because of our level of awareness, we've got ourselves into a pickle, right? In that we don't know how to be home here anymore and satisfy our desires and satisfy the things we need and satisfy all these problems. We have to really fight to and assert that this place is supposed to be home, and we want to make it home. We want, for example, things like affordable housing, right? We want things that are emblematic of what life needs. And also, people are going to respond to that. They're going to respond to the sense of, like, if you're feeling not at home, if you're feeling like you don't belong, how can we do that for you? How do we link easing the problems of destruction of the environment with the construction of an availability of housing and homes, for instance, right? And from that, a possibility for new coalitions, as in some of the people who are allies or working together, there might be new people who need to come into that coalition, new possibilities, new ways of reimagining different people belonging. And when we ground it in life, and we ground it in faith in life and these possibilities, there can be a new coalition that can come together for these issues that can cause a great deal of change, right? Life is far from defeated. Life is far from over, right? And so with that, I open it to questions. Thank you.
Wow, that was excellent. And I'm hoping...
Oh, okay, good.
I'm hoping you're thinking of some questions. I'd like to turn to students first. So students in particular start thinking about a question. But because I'm hosting and a philosopher, I get to ask the first question.
Sure. You're on the spot.
So one question I have, thinkers around this time, some of them are really interested in the idea that there's, well, to use Dr. King's eloquent phrase, there's the arc of the universe. That wondering whether for Thurman there's this idea that there's an aim toward which life is moving, which scientists, biologists and physicists would tell us no, like that's not, you're misunderstanding. Evolution is not progress. Yep. Teleology is verboten, and right. So I'm curious whether Thurman is amongst this camp of having an aim, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, the word teleology, there's a purpose. He's 100% in that. The purpose is realization through repeated integration, which is community, right?
So it's not a concrete state that he thinks is there that we're moving toward. There's not an acorn is aiming to become an oak tree. That state
not like
is
that.
known now, so to speak. For him, it's an open-ended horizon?
Yes. For him, the key word for life is potential. Life is self-realizing potential, self-actualizing potential. And therefore, it just seeks to continually realize itself. And the thing that life has done is realize that it realizes itself through interrelations with itself. Wonderful. And it keeps getting more complex and rich, but there isn't a particular thing where it's like some people like T.R. Deschardins, where there's like an omega point.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, where everything is going to be unified at one point, and that is the true coming of Christ. It's not like that. It's more that there is an ongoing, unknown realization that's going to keep going off into the future. But that shared process of realization is the purpose of life.
Excellent.
So there is a meaning and purpose there. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, starting first with students, if anybody has a question for Dr. Spearman, just raise your hand and maybe mention your name and major if you're willing.
Hi, I'm Henry.
Hi.
I'm a poli-sci and environmental studies major, and my question is a good understanding of Thurman's words to push yourself toward unifying not only yourself with nature and others, but doing that in grabbing of others and saying, you're going to come with me on this journey. We're going to unify not only you and me, but that person, that tree, and everything.
Yes. For him, the movement the civil rights movement, these broader movements for life, as if they do what they're supposed to do, they are going to actualize new possibilities for other life forms, not just ourselves. Even if it's just the things that, we've already realized new possibilities for things like, for instance, corn, right? If you've seen corn, when it's originals, it looks like this. It's not edible, and but now we've grown it to be this big, right? And corn can't even live without us. It can't reproduce we've grown it to be too, juicy for us, that it's husk. It can't peel its own husk. So it needs us to peel the husk so it can reproduce, right? So corn has dramatically changed what it is. And for Thurman, that's what life does. And I would argue that actually trees have done it as well. Like, they've really changed the planet, they've changed the climate, they've made it so that we could come into being and exist. We can build our houses from wood and do all these things. They've realized certain possibility, and we are, among other things, we are an outcome of that. So the question for Thurman is, like, we don't know what's coming next, right? Excellent question.
I'm Ruby. I study political science and French. Would you say that there's one part of Thurman's philosophy that gets particularly misunderstood or misconstrued when you hear about it from other people?
Well, one is just how important nature is in his thinking, and just how important people talk about him. People call him a nature mystic, but the extent that he understands, he grounds his thought in the realization of what all of life is doing throughout history and time. I think that's a bit misrepresented. And he was definitely not really well understood in his own time. W.B. Du Bois, the famous scholar and activist, he said, no one really ever knows what Thurman's actually thinking. Like, it seems like you're not really sure exactly what he believes.
As mystics, though, that's kind of their thing.
I know, that's
right?
what I'm saying, yeah. That's what I'm saying. That's what he's saying, is like, he's like, we're not really exactly sure what he really believes or stands for. But yeah, I think that this aspect of his thought, the connection of other organisms and the common consciousness, that isn't as well understood. People know him way more for his book, for instance, Jesus and the Disinherited, which was the idea that, to identify with Christ is to identify with the oppressed, which is identify with the blacks and the decolonized and indigenous people of the world, that Jesus is revelation, the good news, the gospel is for those who are suffering in the world, and therefore, he should be identified with them. So he's way more well known for those kinds of ideas. Great question.
Another question from a student, and then feel free to open it up to the room.
My name is Jacob. My major is psychology, and I had 2 questions, if that's all right. The first, the best one? All right, I got you.
Oh, I said it was all right, but see, he said no, so just one then.
So the best one, in my opinion, then, is I know Howard Thurman, as you said, is like a mystic. For this idea of the common connection, do you think that would include things such as like spirits, angels, or demons, or is it kind of just limited to like actual living things within the material realm?
Yeah, great question. I think for him, this is why I started off with the quote he had in the beginning, that anything that's transcendental, like an angel or a demon or things like that, has to be grounded in the life process. Because for him, many of those things, to the extent that they exist, still have to have a relationship to life, right? And there's lots of discrepancies around the world about what these things are and what they do, but what is common is that the relationship to them has to have some type of value for life. So for him, that's why he's saying it's better to just ground it in the life process itself and understand what is the life process even trying to do in forging these relationships, or why is it good or bad to relate to a demon or things like that, right? But also many of the stories about the angels and demons he understood symbolically, but even for ones that aren't, the transcendence has to be related to life process.
David, I'm a psychology major.
Yeah.
How would Dr. Thurman integrate nature into cities, as we have this growing trend across the world where people are urbanizing?
Yeah.
So how would he?
I don't know if he would have explicit plans. I could talk about what he would probably envision, but really it's up to engineers or other people like that. And it's up for us to realize that that would be a part of the new possibility, is that there's new ways that life may exist with us, right? We don't see it very clearly, but I mean, we've gotten very comfortable, for instance, with dogs, right? Like, they're pretty noisy, right? I like to run, and they're barking, and then, like, I'm running at 10 o'clock. Like, we accept that. It doesn't bother us to have these yelling, yet we've accepted that if we're gonna have dogs, they're not gonna be quiet, right? So we've integrated them in, and we don't even really notice the sound. We accept. Or that they'll freak us out sometimes when you're walking, they jump up and bark at you, like, We've accepted that they're part of our life in that way. Cats is a whole nother different evil, right? But we've accepted that, right? So for him, there's all kinds of ways we can integrate these life forms into them. Some of them we don't know yet, and so we begin the process, right? But obviously it can look like roadways for animals. It can look for like all kinds of things. We could set up certain types. And lots of cultures have done all kinds of things for that. Like one of my friends, Sneha, she was talking about mice in India. And she's like, yeah, mice are so adorable. Like, there are shrines to them, and like people feed them and things like that. And like they're not necessarily like this absolute horrible pest the way they are here. And so they kind of live with them in a way. Now some people might say, oh my God, how are you having mice around you, right? But they've developed a certain type of relationship that has certain benefits in certain areas. So there's ways that we might have feeding stations or have different areas. We might take apart some buildings and put land or other things there. We might invent some technologies. It may not even look like pure nature space, right? Just as we enjoy some constructed environments, we might be able to craft a place that a fox might enjoy, right? That maybe doesn't look like just bush and trees and stuff, but it might look like different wheels and all kinds of stuff that are developed for that to participate with us.
I wanted to take you back to the discussion of the Black Panthers and make sure I was tracking you and sort of tee up another version of, I think, the relationship that you were chatting about with two different parts of the civil rights movement, but a more contemporary version of it. So Dr. King and Dr. Thurman both were grounded in a religious worldview that had a sense of universal values that they were committed to. You see this in the Dream speech, for example, but it's just prevalent, right? I'm curious whether you think that the contemporary work around anti-racism, Ibram Kendi's book, for example, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I'm not sure I see that there's a strong commitment to a particular set of universal goods in that movement. And so would you agree, and does that mean that that's sort of another way in which that version of the struggle is maybe more like the Black Panthers and less like Thurman and King?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not as familiar with his work, but I know some things about it. And what we see is no one really wants to hold the universal or embrace a broader vision, especially more on the left, right? The people on the right are like, well, we own it and we know it, and so we can force everyone into it. That's why we have to protect it because it's being degenerated, right? But yeah, the Panthers, but also postmodern thought, right?
And there's a link, probably a line between postmodern thought and sort of, the relativism of the left, if we can put it in very broad strokes.
Where it turns into, and some anti-racist work has turned to kind of much more individual reconciling of what's inside of yourself, right? And not so much a question of there's a broader vision, just because, as we see with King and Thurman, that vision was already evolving and going somewhere, which for King, for instance, it meant ending poverty, and it meant ending imperialism, right? So some problematic aspects of anti-racism work, not all of it, but some of it, is that it becomes something that's compatible with, for example, there being maintaining of the maintenance of poverty, right? It's like poverty is a general problem, but you can think about how it's wrong, how you're being racist in certain type of ways, and we can process that, and we don't have to connect it to a broader issue to fundamentally change the nation, right? The idea being if we can change individuals or small collectives, that can lead to something. And so for that thing, I think that's why for me why I like to share Thurman and King is because, and Malcolm X, because there's a commitment to a broader vision that is supposed to be, and they have different reasons for why they believe that and who belongs in it. Like, for example, Malcolm X was very much about Pan-Africanism, right? He believed that all of Africans could form a new unity, a new possibility, and Sunni Islam would be the new universal religion for everybody, right?
Your comments are really showing that what we now refer to as intersectional approaches aren't so new, right? That there were thinkers that were looking at the way in which our relationship to the natural world and relationship to other people were not different struggles. They're not just people who care about people and people who care about nature. That these are, and so it's really interesting to see that this is a longer conversation with deeper roots than maybe we initially thought.
Nice pun, deeper roots. Yeah.
Any other questions from the room? Yes.
Hey, I'm Derek. I'm a grad student in the philosophy program. I wanted to ask more clarification on like the etiology of Thurman's model for community, just in the sense of like, I'm thinking of first, and we've had discussions, you and I, about tribal communities. So I'll use the term non-Western just to relate to my own tribe communities, just in the sense of like, I feel like there's a sense of humility and accepting roles in tribal cultures, and that there isn't a lot of pride, and take that with a grain of salt, but there isn't a lot of pride in tribal communities just because people are so willing to fulfill the role that they've been placed in. Whereas I feel like if we're going to use Western society and like a stereotypical Christian sense, there is this commandment to glorify God, but it very much easily becomes a way of glorifying yourself. And I was wondering if we can't find, or if it's harder to find the origins of how community or life starts, and we have so many different perspectives of what community should be, how do you come to agree and come into a community if there's so many different perspectives?
Yes, great question. So that is the value of the movement. That is the value of a struggle for actualization and liberation, right? It's in the process of doing that. This is Frantz Fanon, this is Bell Hooks, this is a lot of different people, right? It's in that process of striving and struggling that the conditions of the community can emerge and come into being. And to be real, some people are not going to want to be a part of that new community, right? This is the thing. You can't necessarily make a community with everybody. Some people are just going to choose to be outside of it. And that is something that just as you as an organism, this is what Thurman, just as you as an organism, not every microbe gets in, right? Otherwise you get sick or you die, right? But there are new possibilities that we can bring into each other and have a new form of community, but that community that we're forming isn't necessarily the end. It could be the case that we might have to exclude some people or some ways of thinking or whatever as we're doing this, but then in time, something new will happen. We'll say, hey, these people can be integrated. It's an ongoing process. New communities will form, new possibilities from those communities, but the community will have a vital energy, and eventually, like every living thing, it would exhaust itself, and then a new possibility will form. This is where Thurman, he's not against the separatism of the Black Panthers. He thinks it's a necessary step. He thinks it's great that he says, like, defeated the myth of white is beautiful and black is ugly by affirming afros and African culture and things like that. It's a necessary move, but he wants to say that this is not he believes that it's not a permanent move, and the idea being that eventually there'll be a realization that, okay, it's time for a new push for a new form of community again. We had to kind of strengthen ourselves and steel ourselves and discover something new within ourselves as a community, and from that place we can then integrate again. Right? So it's like an ongoing process.
I don't know if you'll remember this. During your talk, you had a wonderful line which is only halfway in my mind. I was seeing if you could say it again. It was something like, "We can't go wrong if we're on the side of life."
Yep. We can't fail.
Can't fail if we're on the side of
lose.
life. And I just